blood come the prince that was promised, and his will be disarmed ice and fire.
The Valyrian freehold was vast, ancient, and powerful, spanning most of the continent of Essos.
The history of our noble houses extends beyond the Seven Kingdoms to the days of old Valyria. For as long as House Targaryen has ruled the skies, House Velaryon has ruled the seas.
Approximately 100 years before Aegon's conquest, when the cataclysmic event of the Doom of Valyria happened. Now, the freehold was never considered an empire by any means, but the powerful dragon riders were never trifled with, and most consider it an empire.
Sheltered there, amidst the great volcanic mountains known as the 14 Flames, were the Valyrians, who learned to tame dragons and make them the most fearsome weapon of war that the world ever saw.
The freehold was later discovered to be the end of dragon riders until Aegon the Conqueror. See, Dany the Dreamer prophesied of the doom of Valyria.
May run your house as you see fit, but you will not decide the future of mine. My house survived the doom,
where the volcanoes would explode and devastation would be in the wake.
Is that it was a cataclysm such as the world had never seen. The ancient mighty freehold, home to dragons and to sorcerers of unrivaled skill, was shattered and destroyed within hours. It was written that every hill for 500 miles split asunder, to fill the air with ash and smoke and fire so hot and hungry that even the dragons in the sky were engulfed and consumed.
But before that, the Valyrian freehold stood a western expansion, with them taking up with the old empire of Guise and taking slavers in their court. They set their eyes elsewhere, with the Andals and the Rhoynar feared to be enslaved or conquered.
The Valyrians expanded in all directions, stretching out east beyond the Giscari cities and west to the very shores of Essos, where even the Giscari had not made inroads. It was this first bursting forth of the new empire that was of paramount importance to Westeros and the future Seven Kingdoms.
They didn't know what they would do. Now, the Rhoynar stood and fought valiantly and nobly, but the Andals feared enslavement, and they fled their homelands, turning their sights to Westeros. Besides the first men and the children of the forest, the Andals would be the second major ethnic group to invade Westeros, and when they came, they brought their customs and culture and their faith, driving a war based on religion and the faith of the Seven, making the first men's castles look weak compared to what they were bringing. The Andals in Essos. It's unknown exactly what drove the Andals to leave Essos, but maesters truly believe that with the Valyrian expansion, they feared enslavement, and so they turned their sights westward to Westeros.
So it is likely the Andals chose to flee rather than face the inevitable slavery that came with Valyrian conquest.
But before that, they lived comfortably in the lands of Andalos. Now, before Andalos even existed, they conquered the hairy men that lived in the sprawling hills before them.
The Andals originated in the lands of the Axe, east and north of where Pentos now lies, though they were for many centuries a migratory people who did not remain in one place for long. From the heartlands of the Axe, a great spur of land surrounded on all sides by the shivering sea, they travelled south and west to carve out Andalus, the ancient realm the Andals ruled before they crossed the narrow sea.
When they saw the gods appeared for them within the vast hills of Andalos, they truly knew that they were doing something that wasn't based on conquest alone, but they had the clarity of the gods themselves. It is said that the Father pulled out a 7-pointed star from the heavens, and that made the king of Andalos the first king, as heater of the hill.
For thousands of years the Andals abided in Andalus, growing in number. In the oldest of the holy books, the seven-pointed star, it is said that the seven themselves walked among their people in the hills of Andalus, and it was they who crowned Hugor of the Hill and promised him and his descendants great kingdoms in a foreign land.
Now, understanding that the Andals were given the right of conquest or laying dominion over men because they had the right and the acceptance of the seven gods. The faith of the seven allowed them to see clearly, and they were blessed by the gods themselves, allowing them to take up threshold against other civilizations. They weren't given a right by man, they were given a right by God. The faith of the seven is no different of that of the old gods of the forest, so sacred and so dear to the children of the forest that they create temples and carve faces on trees to honor the old gods. The faith of the seven are no different. The religion was sparked of ambition and glory and precedent, although
as the sept is a single building with 7 walls. The wealthiest septs of the cities has statues of the seven, and an altar to each. In Winterfell, Sept and Shale hung carved masks from each wall.
the faith of the seven didn't have any temples at this point. They were still derivative of the true gods. And when they came to Westeros, they made sure that the children of the forest and the first men that still worshipped the old gods knew that. The Rhoynar are believed to have taught ironworking to the Andals. When the Andals finally do invade Westeros, they come with new advancements of technology, iron crafting and woodwork. When the first men came, they also came with new technology, iron crafting and woodwork, but they were known as the Bronze Age. The Andals come with iron, silver, and they come with new titles, kings and queens, knights and armies. These are words that hadn't been used yet.
Many of his noble forebears have had posthumous knighthood conveyed upon them by singers and storytellers, but true knighthood only came to Westeros with the Andals.
The first men never really named themselves kings until the Andals invaded and decided to take the names and claim them as their own. The culture, or the legacy, of the Andals after they invaded are heavily embarked by the influence and the practice that we see the faith of the seven in Western and Common Era. The old gods and the new gods go hand in hand, whether you pray to the faith of the seven or the old gods of the first men. The heavy influence of the Andals are embedded in the ties of the culture within Westeros. If they never invaded, the faith of the seven would have never been indoctrinated within the temples and the seven-pointed star. When the Andals came, they brought the faith of the seven, marking the heroic triumphs of the knights and kings. The Andals had iron, while the first men only had bronze.
The fact that the Andals forged iron has been taken by some as proof that the seven guided them, that the smith himself taught them this art, and so do the holy texts teach. But the Rhoynar were already an advanced civilization at this time, and they too knew of iron, so it takes only the study of a map to realize that the earliest Andals must have had contact with the Rhoynar.
The Andals brought a superior writing system, which the first men only wrote in runes. Although, over history, it has been written when the Andal invasion happened, and the people who transcribed these were mostly that of Andalos origin, the history is biased compared to the first men or the children of the forest. The Andals were so well educated to the point where they made the history favor one triumph over another. So the children of the forest and the first men didn't really have a voice. Now, George R. R. Martin has stated, through thousands of years, no one is truly a first men or an Andalos because of bloodlines and traditions dating back thousands of years ago. Yes, the Starks have first men blood, but it's not pure first men blood. The faith of the Seven is heavily influenced, and we see this in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. Alicent has adopted the custom and belief system of the faith of the Seven, holding it true and sacred. Upholding holy vows, oaths, and simple faiths are very much sacred to Westeros and their customs.
For the king's suffering, did the maesters also prescribe the removal of Targaryen heraldry and the installation in its stead of various statues and stars?
The emblems of the Seven serve only to guide us on an uncertain path, to remind us of a higher authority.
Although there are old gods and the drowned gods that also hold a sway, it's in specific regions. The old god is mostly in the north, in the northern region, while the drowned god holds sway over the Iron Islands. The faith of the Seven is heavily indoctrinated all throughout Westeros, and because of that, the invasion of the Andals is very ingrained in Westeros. According to the seven-pointed star, the gods gave their blessing of Hoarder of the Hill, the first king of the Andals. Formally crowning him of a seven-pointed star, the maiden gave him a wife that bore him 40 sons, as foretold by the crone. The warrior granted him strength, and the smith gave him an iron-plated suit, that of for his son. The crone peered through a door of death and let in the first raven. Now tell me that doesn't have something to do with Bloodraven or the dreams that Brandon Stark has. The faith arrived in Westeros with the Andals, replacing the worship of the old gods.
Catelyn studied the faces. The father was bearded, as ever. The mother smiled, loving and protective. The warrior had his sword sketched in beneath his face, the smith his hammer. The maid was beautiful, the crone wizened and wise. And the seventh face, the stranger, was neither male nor female, yet both, ever the outcast, the wanderer from far places, less and more than human, unknown and unknowable. Here the face was a black oval, a shadow with stars for eyes.
Some Andal warriors carved a seven-pointed star on their chest, and the High Tower's early adoption of the faith made them build the first sept in Old Town. Now, all across the realm, they began doing this as well, but Old Town became the center force of the faith, with the starry-eyed sept housing the High Sparrow Islands. King Harmon II of the Iron Islands invoked that the faith of the Seven, with that knowledge, the drowned god could be the eighth god. However, with the priests and the septs disputing this, he later said that the drowned god is an aspect of the stranger, but he did not bow to the faith of the Seven and did not give up the drowned god, which, right on, man, I understand. Like, do not bow to them. Understanding the faith of the Seven a little bit more, let's talk about each individual seven. So, the Father above is supposed to be a bearded-faced man that invokes and to pray for justice and protection within battle. Most men that are fathers would pray for him for strength, purity, and advice to keep your oath and to understand your course ahead. The mother is a loving, protecting individual that is supposed to embark mercy. A lot of the times you can hear Alicent or Catelyn say something like, "Mother, have mercy on us all." A sense of safety for loved ones and endearment is also supposed to help you in your pregnancy, while the warrior is to give you strength and invoke a sense of an stillness within battle, strength, victory, and also peace within the aftermath. The smith is supposed to represent a hammer, praying for strength, purity, and justice on the battlefield. The maiden is a beautiful and innocent young woman, praying for safety for young women and encouragement for new brides. The crone is an old and wise woman, a sense of wisdom and guidance. The stranger is nor female or male. No gender is specific, as they are the death They are the idea of the other world, stepping foot inside something that's beyond our perception. Now, the stranger reminds me of the others, or the White Walkers, death itself.
The morning air was dark with the smoke of burning gods. They were all afire now, maid and mother, warrior and smith, the crone with her pearl eyes, and the father with his gilded beard, even the stranger carved to look more animal than human.
Now, within the Faith of the Seven, there is a lot of separate branches, if you will, with high septs and priests and silent sisters and holy brothers. How do you tell them apart? The priest can be male or female, but is a God-fearing belief system, as a sept or a scepter represents the forthcoming and revokes their last name, so they will only ever be known as a sept or a scepter. Because of this, they take a holy vow, and is only dubbed in a white robe and a 7-pointed star as their belt. They will have several artifacts depicting their rank within the household, and you can see them in small villages without a sept, but typically you see them in the sept. Cersei has a hard time understanding the dedication of the High Sparrow because she has never been a heavily faithed. Now, we see in House of the Dragon, Alicent has taken on the belief system of the Faith of the Seven, which gives her strength. The Silent Sisters are the handmaidens of the stranger. They also revoke a oath to the crone, the stranger, so that they will only ever prepare the bodies of the dead. They take a silent vow. You will hardly ever see them talking. A holy brother or a holy sister could be a humble servant of the gods, dressed in similar dressed robes and garments. Although they are basically in waiting, they will probably become a priest or a priestess at some point, but they are in the beginning stages of that. Death and life is depicted as a candle flame. Once it is extinguished, life after death is in the hallowed halls of the Father, a golden veil of 7 heavens and 7 hells. The faith upholds this with the sinner's destruction of the deepest of hells. So if you betray oaths and is a mastermind of killers, then you will be in the depth of hell. Because they believe that there is 7 heavens and 7 hells, there's levels to that. You can either go to the best heaven or you can go to the worst heaven. It depends how dedicated to the faith you truly are. If you practice dark arts or demonic infestations, then you will be going to the Lord of the 7 hells. Now, since we got the culture and geography and the expansion of the history of the Andals, let's talk about the Andals coming to Westeros. Westeros had already survived its first cataclysmic battle, to say fighting against 2 races known as the First Men and the Children of the Forest. Although this fighting lasted generations and was the warfare that many feared, the pact sealed the 2 people's fates. For 4,000 years, peace and worship of the old gods by the First Men had endured, and the Age of the Heroes also was story of legend and myth. Now, since the Andals would invade, how much longer would the conflict last? Would they come for a peace? Would they come waiting for a pact? They wouldn't. They came with their religion, the Faith of the Seven, and their teachings, as they had the one true religion. And as they laid waste to armies, there came as conquerors. They left behind dragon riders, and they were brilliantly fierce.
Somewhere beyond the sunset, across the narrow sea, lay a land of green hills and flowered plains and great rushing rivers, where towers of dark stone rose amidst magnificent blue-grey mountains, and armoured knights rode to battle beneath the banners of their lords. The Dothraki call that land Reush Andali, the land of the Andals,
They did not want to have to leave another homeland, so they would claim Westeros for themselves and not have to bow to anyone ever again. The coming of the Andals has very many names within the history books of Game of Thrones. The coming of the Andals, the invasion of the Andals, the crossing of the Andals, the Andals' arrivement of Essos to Westeros. But time and time again, the sources date back to 6,000 years ago. Of the true histories state it was 4,000 years ago to some maesters' recollection. Many believe that petty kings of the first men were destroyed because of the Andal invasion, and the children of the forest were slaughtered in thousands, pushing them back to the north. They did not take the land in peace, rather in bloodshed. The Andals came for the first men, laying waste to castles and villages. The maesters believed that they feared the conquest of the dragons, and because of that, they did not want to have their people enslaved. The Andals came with the right of conquest. They came with the Iron Age, and because of that, it was a stark contrast to the Bronze Age, which heralded in the first men. The first men never stood a chance at the technology that the Andals came with, and because of that, conquest was easy for the Andals, starting in the Vale of Arryn.
Isolated from the rest of Westeros by its towering mountains, the Vale proved the perfect ground for the Andals to carve out the first kingdoms in this new land. The first men who were there before the Andals fought these sea-born conquerors stubbornly, but the Vale was but thinly peopled in those days, and they soon found themselves outnumbered in every fight.
Largely ruled by a number of petty kings, some of who allied with the Andals instantly instead of resisting them. The shells and the bright stones were betrayed by the Andals' allegiance, and the Andals claimed the fingers instead of coexisting.
An Andal knight named Corwin Corbray took the daughter of the former for his bride, and the wife of the latter for his bedwarmer, and claimed the fingers for his own. Though Corbray, unlike many of his fellows, never named himself a king, preferring the more modest style of Lord of the Five Fingers.
The Sheds of Goldtown later aligned with the Andals against the Royces, but the conflict sadly ended with Goldtown being controlled by the Andals. King Uric, sixth of his name, Royce, led most of the pursuit with his heirs against the first men and the Andals. Later, King Robert II gained the support of Redfort, Hunter, Bailey, Coldwater, and Upcliff. Colbraes, Grafton, and Hammer of the Hills were defeated with the unification of the First Men Kings, and the successful defeat of these warlords came as a victory. However, Rubar's army was rounded off in the Battle of the Seven-Pointed Star, and the Vale was later controlled by the Andals, and House Royce was made. Not much is known about the Battle of the Seven Stars.
All that is certain is that King Robar II of House Royce met Sir Artes Arryn in a great battle at the foot of the Giant's Lance, where the king died and the Falcon Knight dealt the first men a blow from which they never recovered.
But what is known is once the Andals invaded, trying to conquer the Vale, the native First Men Kings rose and revolted. As they had been here for now thousands of years, they did not roll over like dogs. If the Andals wanted to come conquer them, they would not give them their lands without a fight. The remaining First Men houses began to rise and rebel against
No fewer than 14 of the oldest and noblest houses of the Vale ended that day. Those whose lines endured, the Red Forts, the Hunters, the Coldwaters, the Belmores, and the Royces themselves amongst them, did so only by the dint of yielding up gold and land and hostages to their conquerors, and bending their knees to swear fealty to Artes Arryn, the first of his name, new-crowned King of Mountain and Vale.
the Andals. Some unified against King Rubard. He declared and crowned himself High King of the Vale, the Fingers, and the Mountains of the Moon. After he declared this, they began war. He defeated Kyle Corbray, the Gruftons, and the Hammer of the Hill. This defeat gave him strength, gave all of the First Men strength, that the Andals would not take their lands. The Andals, destroyed and distraught by this defeat, united behind the young Sir Artie Arryn, an Andal knight born near the Giant's Land. Rhubarb's first men who were on foot fortified their position where the Giant's lance at their back, leading the trenches and lining them with spears and stakes. The Andals only arrived at dusk 3 days later. Andal's songs claim that the Andals began their attack when they saw 7 stars in the dawn sky. The first men resisted the first 6 attacks, but the 7th was led by Torgor Tugget, who slew Lord Redfort and Ugger Upcliff. To prevent a riot, King Rhubarb led the first men's counterattack and slew Turgold the Grim. However, hoping to render the Andals leaderless, Rhubarb led a duel with Art Arryn, slaying the armored knight. Before they knew it, 500 Andal knights were attacking the first men. Now see, Art Arryn was a coward and hid behind cloaks.
Leading the attack was a champion in silvered steel, with a moon and falcon on his shield and wings upon his war helm. Sir Arties Arryn had clad one of his knight's retainer in his spare suit of armour, leaving him in camp whilst he himself took his best horseman up and around a goat track that he remembered from his childhood, so they might reappear behind the first men and descend on them from above.
King Robert Royce was actually not fighting Art Arryn. He instead dressed in different armor and led a charge of 500 Andal knights heading towards the first men. This sadly resulted in King Rhubarb Royce's death, and the remaining first men fled into the mountainlands,
Preying upon any man fool enough to enter their mountains without a strong escort. Little better than the free folk beyond the wall, these mountain clans too are called wildlings by the civilized.
The first men refused to submit to House Arryn and fled, deciding that they would become the mountain lands of the Vale instead of bending the knee. After conquering and succeeding the Vale, the Andal warlords continued west towards the Bloody Gates and sailed up towards the Trident into the Riverlands, where they established their own small kingdoms. The tales of this era include the fall of Maidenpool and the defeat of the young king.
The true history of the Riverlands begins with the coming of the Andals. After crossing the narrow sea and sweeping over the Vale, these conquerors from the east moved to make it their own, sailing their lung ships up the Trident and its 3 great branches. In those days, it seems, the Andals fought in bands behind chieftains, whom the later Septons would name kings.
The Widow Fort, where the Lord Dowrian 3 sons held off Vord Vindarin and his Andals for a day and a night, slaying hundreds before they were slayed themselves, and the events of that night in the White Wood would be lost to history.
Of the Widow's Ford, where 3 sons of Lord Darry held back the Andal warlord, Vorian Vibrant, and his knights for a day and a night, slaying hundreds before they fell themselves.
The Blackwoods and the Brackens allied to oppose the Andals, which, I gotta say, that's a lot of work for those two. I'm very proud of them. But they shattered 7 and 7 charges of Andal knights and septons in the great battle of Bitter River. The greatest of the River Kings to oppose the Andals was Tristan of Mud, whom the Tullys fought alongside in many of his campaigns. Tristar is started to fought 100 battles, winning 99, and only losing one. The king of the Mountain and Vale invaded the Riverlands. He won several small victories, demolishing petty kings of the First Men. He found himself later facing off with Tristan, who smashed him forcefully, and the Vale men retreated. One of Royland's allegiances betrayed him to the River King, Tristan, beheading Royland at the House of Mudseat of Oldstone. Tristan was defeated in his 100th battle. After conquering and defeating, he later was slain by the Andals, and the Mud King throne later fell to the Andals. The First Men, instead of being slaughtered, submitted, and later intermarried with the Andals. When the Andals tried to conquer Crockle Point, which is now part of the Crownlands, they realized that instead of conquering by swords or war, they should just make marriage alliances and infiltrate through the bloodline. I largely talk about the war between the Andals and the First Men, but the Andals came with the faith of the Seven, and the only people challenging with another faith was largely the children of the forest. So they burned weirwood trees, groves, and slew children of the forest. They did not find them obeisant and ruled to the true history, so they killed them in the thousands.
The conquerors looked upon the old gods of the First Men and the children of the forests as little more than demons, and fell upon the weirwood groves sacred to them with steel and fire, destroying the great white trees wherever they found them, and hacking out their carved faces. The great hill called High Heart was especially holy to the First Men, as it had been to the children of the forest before them.
In Game of Thrones, the hit TV show, it is shown that the children of the forest were being slain so much that they resulted to create the White Walkers to challenge the First Men because they were fighting a losing battle. But that is not true. The First Men killed them, yes, but the pack set aside a different part. And if we were going to say they were dying, they were definitely dying during the Andal Invasion. The Andals pretty much wiped out the children. After centuries of infighting between the Andal King, House Justaman was able to pick up the ruins of the Riverlands and claim Riverlands as their own. Now, the Isle of Faces was never conquered by the Andals, but the Andals believed the First Men and the children of the forest especially were abominations, and those creatures needed to be wiped out. The true telling states that the children fled the Riverlands long before, but some believe that the Andals attacked the High Heart, a sacred place of the children of the forest of the Riverland, and killed them in thousands. The Andals did not have enough of conquest, and they continued down to the Stormlands. When the Andals began crossing the Narrow Sea, Erich the Unready was the Storm King for House Durrandon of the Storm End. He took little interest in the invaders, as he was already dealing with another war at the time, and he died right after the Andals finally ended their conquest in the Vale.
Eric VII Durrandon was king in the Stormlands when the Andal longships first began to cross the Narrow Sea. History remembers him as Eric the Unready, for he took little note of these invaders, famously declaring that he had no interest in the quarrels of strangers in a land far away.
Shortly after, the Andals conquered the Vale, and they began sailing at Blackwater Bay and invaded the Stormlands. The Andal Targaryen Bard Emin allied with the First Men of House Marcy and expelled the Stormlanders from Marcy's Hook.
The Storm King held his conquest for less than 2 years. An Andal warlord named Targaryen Bar Emin, called Targaryen the Terrible, had established his own small kingdom north of the Blackwater, but was being hard-pressed by the Darkland King of Duskendale. Sensing weakness to the south, Targaryen took to wife the daughter of Joshua, Softspear, and crossed Blackwater Bay with all his power to establish a new kingdom on Massey's Hook.
And established Andal control over the peninsula. The grandson of King Erected the Unready, King Quanta the Conqueror, was the first Storm King to face off in battle with the Andals, and the reign of his successors, Quanta the Third and Marford the Fifth, would be sent continuously warning off the Andals. The Storm Kings won at last 6 major battles against the Andals, including the Great Battle of Bronze Gate, where King Martyr V Durrandon defeated the Holy Brother of the Andals at the cost of his own life, but the Andals continued to invade, conquering Tarth and Westermont. King Baldric the Cunning manipulated the petty kings of the Andals and the warlords of Kate Wrath into an attack on each other. To prevent the Andals from conquering the Redwood, King Durrandon aligned with the Children of the Forest and their Weirwood alliance, approaching victory over the Andals at the Blackwood, the Misty Woods, and the Howland Hills, and helped the check of the decline of the Kingdom of the Storm for a time. A generation later, and the allegiance of 3 Dornish kings and the defeat of Andal invaders came in the Battle of the River Sloane. Finally, after the 7th battle, the 7th attempt of conquering the great castle of Storm's End, the Andals realized that they would never be able to conquer the Durrandons, and instead chose a marriage pact. I just can't believe it took them so long to realize that the Storm Kings would never bow to you, and they were never able to truly conquer the Stormlands, only within a marriage pact.
In the end, the two sides simply came together. King Malden IV took an Andal maiden as his wife, as did his son Durin the 24th, Durin Half-Blood. Andal war chiefs became lords and petty kings, wed the daughters of storm lords, and gave them their own daughters in return, did fealty for their lands, and swore their swords to the Storm Kings.
The Andals instead intermarried with the first men Storm Lords, King Mordor and his son Durrandon, for a marriage alliance. Andal maidens were given. The Andals swore that the Storm Kings were allowed to be kings, and his queen would adopt the custom and still have the custom of the Faith of the Seven. With conquest on the rise and defeat heavy in the air, the Andals turned their sights towards the north. When the Andals came in the eastern shore of the north, they were aggressive, met by the King of Winter, House Stark of Winterfell.
The North's long, ragged coastlines, both to the east and the west, remained vulnerable, however. It would be there where the rule of Winterfell would be most oft-threatened, by Arnborn in the west and Andals in the east. Crossing the narrow sea in their hundreds and thousands, the longships of the Andals made landings in the north just as they did to the south.
And their bannermen that were the first men. The wolves were hungry. King Theon Stark was supported by House Bolton, and the Andal warlords Oggod's 7th sword attacked and was slain in the Battle of the Weeping Water.
But wherever they came ashore, the Starks and their bannermen fell upon them and drove them back into the sea. King Theon Stark, known to history as the Hungry Wolf, turned back the greatest of these threats, making common cause with the Boltons to smash the Andal warlord Arga's 7th Star at the Battle of the Weeping Water.
Theon then sailed, raiding Andalos and dismounting the heads of Andalos victims along the shore of the north.
In the aftermath of his victory, King Theon raised his own fleet and crossed the narrow sea to the shores of Andalus, with Argas's corpse lashed to the prow of his flagship. There, it is said, he took a bloody vengeance, burning a score of villages, capturing 3 tar houses and a fortified sept, and putting hundreds to the sword. The heads of the slain the Hungry Wolf claimed as prizes, carrying them back to Westeros and planting them on spikes along his own coasts as a warning to other would-be conquerors.
After the conquest of the Trident and the Riverlands, the Andals began to attack the north in the southward of the Frontlands. However, each attack threw them back in the neck and they became stronger and stronger, with the northern men securing Moat Cailin with an unknown amount of armies that the Andals have. The neck continuously worked in the northern men's favor. The Andals kept losing over and over again. The legend of the rat cook served bacon and Prince Pie and Andal King. Eventually, the Andals retorted, and the North was allowed to remain in peace, along serving a millennia of Andal bloodshed that endured the dynastic dispute of marriages. Dorne stays out of the wars for the most part, and the influence of the Andals were less in the Dornish, keeping those southern kingdoms away from the western expansion of the Andals, and they never really steered towards the Dornish sea. Breaking up the timeline a little bit, I forgot to talk about the Westerlands. Now, after the Andals began the invasion and headed towards the Westerlands after conquering the Vale and the Riverlands, Tide-Pold Lannister, the King of the Rock, defeated the first invasion of the Andal warlords, and the next few attacks were also successfully defeated against House Lannister. The Andals continued to march west. However, the King Tywin had an arrangement made between their bannermen and the most powerful of the warlords. The children of the Andals were brought to Casterly Rock to serve as wards but also hostages. After the death of King Gerald and his daughter's husband, the Andals served Joffrey Lancelot, told the Lannister name. Other houses formed between the indisputed marriage in between House Broxton, Doxton, Just, Kendon, Lancelot, Bidman, Pershman, Southfield, and Sparsh. In contrast, the most first men king of the support of the Andals allowed the King on the Rock to expand their western power. It took a while for the invasion to cross to the Reach. The Andals arrived late, especially because they were being prevented to sail their fleet because of the high towers of Old Town and the redwood of the Arbor. Now, the high towers really block a lot of people's way. The Gardener King of Highgarden prevented the destruction of the kingdom of the Reach. King Gawain sought out for help with the children of the forest, while King Morden focused on factions and how he needed to bestow his woods witch who claimed that she could raise the army of the dead.
Mern III, the Madling, showered gold and honours on a woods witch who claimed that she could raise armies of the dead to throw the Andals back. Lord Redwine built more ships, and Lord Hightower strengthened the walls of Old Town.
However, the kings feared an attack from the Andals, though it never came. Now I want to pause just for a second to talk about the Woods Witch who claimed that she could raise the army of the dead. Like we didn't see this before. Everybody put the blame on the children of the forest in the hit TV show Game of Thrones, and a lot of people speculate that the children of the forest had some implication on it. But could a Woods Witch have really practiced the magic of necromancy, creating the ice creatures we see and fear? Death plagued beyond the wall? Is this a possibility? Does it have something to do with blood magic? I have a lot of questions that we don't have the answers for. When the Andals finally made it to the Reach, to the realm of the Gardeners a generation later, they were welcomed by the three saged kings, Garth, the son of Marth, and the grandson Gerald. Regardless of the later threats, the lands and wives and the lords of the highest ranking Andals were granted. Garth IX brought a sept sept to his court and built the first sept at Highgarden.
Garth the Ninth's gardener, his son Merle the First, the Meek, and his grandson Gwain the Fifth were very different men, but they shared a common policy towards the Andals, one based on accord and assimilation rather than armed resistance. Garth the Ninth brought a septon to his court and made him part of his councils, and built the first sept at Highgarden, though he himself continued to worship in the castle Godswood.
Marth, a conversion of the faith of the Seven, preached the conversion of septs, scepters, and mother houses across the Reach. Garner was the first gardener born into the new faith and the first to be knighted. In order to secure the newcomers, Marth and Garth took the Andals to bride, and all three kings accepted Andal knights and retained the customs of the Andals. House Hightower of Oldtown was also the first lords to welcome the Andals. Lord Darren of House Hightower set aside his own wife to marry an Andal princess and secured the stability of trade and customs within the faith, and House Hightower accepted the faith of the Seven. After Darren's parent death, his son, the young Tristane, was raised and treated with the faith and the sept of Westeros, who eventually became the first High Sparrow. In regards to the technology of the Andals, the gardeners sat back in amazement of the craftsmanship and the woodworking, the blacksmiths and the snowmasons, settling into the Reach the supplied bannermen and the iron instills of the bronze, letting that go to welcome in the Iron Age. Former families wed into the first men, and the Andal nobility continued. Maester Yundel writes that this conquest was simply approached without any bloodshed. The Iron Islands is a different story, and the first men were very much strategic in their planning. The Andals returned their attention to the Iron Islands nearly 2,000 years after they even set foot in Westeros. The Andals invaded, settling in the Riverlands, Westerlands, the Reach, and now they began to settle into castles, moats, and Rayleigh Fort. The strong, timbersome conquest allowed the Andals a secured fort, but it also weakened the grasp of the Iron Islands on the Sunset Sea. The Andals began to invade, leaving the Iron Islands in waves of disarray and destruction. Rhaegar Greyjoy, king of the Iron Islands, was defeated by an alliance of Andals with House Dubbard, Greyjoy, Moten, Oakwood, and the continuous of legacies within the House of Hortwon. With the chosen of a king through the fingers dancing, the Archmaester Hodor states that because the kings chose to marry the daughter with the Andal warlord, helped to prevent the destruction of the Ironborn. And they did this in such a cunning way that it made it so that the preservation of the Drowned God stayed intact.
Though most Ironborn have naught but scorn for the Seven of the South and the old gods of the North, they do recognize a second deity. In their theology, the Drowned God is opposed by the Storm God, a malignant deity who dwells in the sky and hates men and all their works. He sends cruel winds, lashing rains, and the thunder and lightning that bespeak his endless wrath.
Because the Andals married into the Iron Islands in such a regard that the wives and the kids from the Andals chose to adopt the custom of the native Drowned God. The conquest and the aftermath of the invasion in Westeros. The Andals took Westeros by a storm.
Sweeping through the Vale with fire and sword, the Andals began their conquest of Westeros. Their iron weapons and armor surpassed the bronze with which the first men still fought.
Now, one of the largest mistakes or consequences to the invasions was the ending of the pack. Now, when the first men and the children of the forest were at war for generations, they decided to stand still on their war, creating peace within the pack. And because of this, the children of the forest and the first men coexisted, bringing in the Dawn Age, the Age of Heroes, and the Long Night together, rewriting history entirely. Although this history is now written by septors and septas, it still stands to be one of the largest, most pivotal roles in Westeros. Now, because when the Andals came, the children of the forest were completely extinguished, to the point where most believe that they are myth and do not exist, adopts the titles of King of the First Men, Andals, and Rhoynar. They do not accept the Children of the Forest as an ethnic group that shaped the pivotal lives of Westeros, and this is because of the Andal influence. Another thing with the Andal influence regards to the Faith of the Seven. The Faith of the Seven is one of, if not the majority of the faiths that is widely regarded within the Westeros. Now, they refer to the old gods and the new, but typically practices are widely considered that the new gods are the true gods, and they are the ones that you need to be worshipping, especially within the book and where George has left us in A Dance of Dragons. The faith has really taken up arms, punishing those that are rightfully need to be based on trial. And because of this, the Sept has not even crowned Tommen as the rightful king, seeing as they believe he is a bastard and needs to be punished by his crimes. Keep in mind, Tommen is a child, but this is the lengths that the Sept would go to, because they believe their gods are just. Now, that is not to say that the old gods are not in Westeros. They are, but majority in the north, where the Andals couldn't conquer. Expanse westwards instead of northwards. They couldn't challenge the first men in the north because they were hardy and they knew the lands better than them. Conquest wasn't easy for them, and they lost too many times to count. The Andals came with a wave of movement and feared of being slaved.
They retreated to the Axe, the lands from which they had sprung, and when that did not protect them, they retreated farther north and west until they came to the sea. Some might have given up there and surrendered to their fate, and others still might have made their last stand, but many and more made ships and sailed in great numbers across the narrow sea to the lands of the first men in Westeros.
With the expansion of the Valyrian freehold, they believed that they would die or be enslaved. They did not want to be conquered. They did not want to bend the knee. In that regard, they had to turn their sights westwards. And because of that, Westeros bled for it. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and I hope you guys have a great day. I'm going to be working on another video talking about honor in Westeros. I really want to do the Ned Stark chapter breakdown. I just had not gotten the time to really sit down and break down his chapters right. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. Watchers be on the wall.